The bruise on Beatrice Zimmerman's cheek had faded from purple to a sickly yellow-green, but the memory of how she got it remained as fresh as the moment her father's fist had connected with her face. She stood in the dusty street of Jamestown, California, her worn carpetbag clutched in trembling hands, watching the stagecoach disappear into the distance with the last of her money tucked into the driver's pocket. It was June of 1876, and she had just turned 21 years old 3 days ago, celebrated by finally gathering the courage to run away from the ranch where every day had been a lesson in survival, and every night a prayer that her father would drink himself unconscious before he remembered she existed. The sun beat down mercilessly on the small mining town, making the air shimmer above the wooden walkways that lined the main street. Beatrice's dark hair hung limp and dusty around her shoulders, and her simple cotton dress, once a pale blue, had turned gray from the long journey. She had no plan, no destination beyond a way, and now she stood in a town she'd never seen before with exactly $3.42 to her name. A group of miners stumbled out of the saloon across the street, their laughter loud and rough. Beatrice flinched instinctively, her body remembering before her mind could catch up, and she turned quickly to walk in the opposite direction. Her feet carried her down the street, past the general store and the blacksmith shop, past the church with its white-painted steeple, until the buildings began to thin out and the wild country beyond town stretched before her. She didn't see the man until she nearly walked straight into him. He stood in front of the livery stable, tall enough that she had to crane her neck to see his face. He was the biggest man she'd ever seen, easily over 6 feet with shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun behind him. His hair, a dark brown that caught hints of copper in the light, fell past his shoulders in thick waves. A beard covered the lower half of his face, neatly trimmed but full. His arms, exposed by rolled-up sleeves, showed muscles that rippled as he adjusted the pack on the mule beside him. Everything about him spoke of strength and power, the kind that could break a person in half without much effort. Beatrice's breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled backward, her carpetbag falling from her hands. She raised her arms instinctively to protect her face, her entire body tensing for the blow she knew would come. Men that big were always angry, always violent. Her father had taught her that lesson well. "Easy there, miss," a deep voice rumbled, surprisingly soft despite its bass timbre. "I didn't mean to startle you." Beatrice kept her arms up, her eyes squeezed shut, waiting. But nothing happened. No rough hands grabbing her, no fist flying toward her face, no shouted curses. She opened one eye cautiously. The big man had taken several steps back, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. His face, what she could see of it beneath the beard, held an expression of concern rather than anger. His eyes, a striking gray-blue like storm clouds, watched her with an unexpected gentleness. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice still quiet, still careful. "You dropped your bag. May I pick it up for you?" Beatrice slowly lowered her arms, her heart still hammering against her ribs. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The man moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his movements visible and non-threatening as he bent down to retrieve her carpetbag. He held it out to her, but when she reached for it, her hand shook so badly that she nearly dropped it again. His large hand came up to steady the bag, and his fingers brushed against hers. Beatrice jerked back as if burned, and the man immediately withdrew. "Sorry," he said. "I should have been more careful. Are you all right? You look like you've had a rough journey." Beatrice found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "I'm fine, thank you. I apologize for nearly running into you." The man studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that those storm cloud eyes could see right through her, could see every bruise hidden beneath her dress, every scar etched into her soul. But when he spoke again, his tone remained gentle. "I'm Preston Rourke. I run a trap line up in the mountains, but I come into town for supplies every few weeks. I haven't seen you around Jamestown before." "I just arrived on the stage," Beatrice said, clutching her bag to her chest like a shield. "I'm looking for work." Preston nodded slowly. "Work can be hard to find around here for a young woman on her own. Most of the employment is in the mines or logging camps, and those aren't safe places." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "The saloons are always looking for girls, but I wouldn't recommend that path if you have any other choice." Beatrice felt her cheeks flush. She knew what he was implying, and he was right to warn her, but the suggestion still stung. "I can cook and clean." I worked on a ranch before I came here. I'm not afraid of hard work. A ranch hand. Preston's eyebrows rose slightly. That's unusual for a woman. My father owned the ranch, Beatrice said, then immediately wished she hadn't. She didn't want to talk about her father, didn't want to explain why she'd left. He needed the help. Preston's eyes drifted to the fading bruise on her cheek, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly beneath his beard. When he spoke again, his voice held a note of steel beneath the gentleness. Your father do that to you? Beatrice's hand flew to her face, covering the bruise. I should go. Thank you for your help, Mr. Rourke. She tried to step around him, but he moved slightly, not blocking her path but making her pause. Wait, I'm sorry, that was too forward of me. But if you're looking for honest work, I might be able to help. Mrs. Sullivan, who runs the boarding house, has been complaining about needing help ever since her daughter moved to San Francisco. She's a good woman, fair employer. I could introduce you if you'd like. Beatrice hesitated. Every instinct told her not to trust this man, not to trust any man, but something in his eyes made her pause. There was no calculation there, no hidden agenda that she could detect, just genuine concern and a desire to help. Why would you do that for me? You don't know me, she said. Preston was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. Let's just say I know what it's like to need a fresh start. Everyone deserves a chance to build a better life. Come on, the boarding house is just back up the street. You don't have to decide anything right now. Just meet Mrs. Sullivan and hear what she has to offer. Against her better judgment, Beatrice nodded. Preston gestured for her to walk ahead of him, keeping a respectful distance as they made their way back toward the center of town. The boarding house was a 2-story building with a wide front porch, painted a cheerful yellow that stood out among the weathered wood of the surrounding structures. A sign hung above the door reading, Sullivan's Boarding House Clean Rooms and Good Meals. Preston knocked on the door, and it was opened a moment later by a plump woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her face lit up when she saw Preston. Preston Rourke! I was wondering when you'd show your face in town again. Come in, come in. I saved you some pie from yesterday. Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan, but I'm actually here on different business. This is Miss... Preston turned to Beatrice, realizing he didn't know her name. Beatrice Zimmerman, she supplied. Miss Zimmerman just arrived in town and is looking for work. I remembered you mentioning you needed help around here. Mrs. Sullivan's sharp eyes assessed Beatrice in a single sweeping glance, taking in the worn dress, the carpet bag, and the fading bruise. Her expression softened immediately. Come in, dear. Preston, you're welcome to stay, but I imagine you have supplies to collect before you head back up the mountain. Preston nodded. I do need to finish up at the general store. Miss Zimmerman, it was a pleasure to meet you. Mrs. Sullivan will take good care of you. He tipped his hat to both women and turned to leave. Mr. Rourke, Beatrice called out before she could stop herself. He turned back and she forced herself to meet his eyes. Thank you. Truly. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his rugged features. You're welcome, Miss Zimmerman. I hope to see you around town. Then he was gone, his long strides carrying him quickly down the street. Beatrice watched him go, something strange and unfamiliar stirring in her chest. She'd never met a man like that before, never encountered that combination of strength and gentleness. She didn't quite know what to make of it. That Preston is a good man, Mrs. Sullivan said, drawing Beatrice's attention back. Known him for near about 5 years now. He came out here after the war, wanted to get away from civilization for a while. Lives up in the mountains, mostly keeps to himself, but he's always been kind and respectful. Now, let's talk about this job. Can you cook? Yes, madam. And clean, and do laundry and tend a garden, whatever you need. Mrs. Sullivan led her into a parlor furnished with comfortable if well-worn furniture. I run a respectable establishment here. I have 6 rooms for rent, usually full with miners or businessmen passing through. I serve breakfast and dinner included with the room rate. My daughter used to help me, but she married a lawyer and moved to the city last fall. I've been managing on my own, but I'm not getting any younger, and the work is getting to be too much. I can offer you room and board plus $3 a week. The room is small, up in the attic, but it's clean and private with a good lock on the door. You'll work hard, but I'm not a harsh taskmaster. How does that sound? Beatrice felt tears prick at her eyes. It sounded like a dream, like more than she'd dared to hope for. "That sounds wonderful, Mrs. Sullivan. When would you like me to start?" "How about right now? You look like you could use a good meal and a bath. Let me show you to your room, and then we'll get you settled. Tomorrow morning is soon enough to start your duties." The room in the attic was exactly as Mrs. Sullivan had described, small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk for her belongings. A small window looked out over the back garden. It was the first space that had ever been truly hers, and Beatrice stood in the doorway for a long moment, hardly able to believe her good fortune. That night, after a meal of roast chicken and vegetables that was better than anything she'd eaten in months, Beatrice lay in her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the boarding house settling around her. She thought about Preston Rourke, about the way he'd stepped back when she'd flinched, the way he'd kept his distance and his voice gentle. She thought about his eyes, gray-blue and kind, and the way his massive hands had handled her carpet bag with such care. She'd never known a man could be like that. In her experience, men were loud and rough and violent. They took what they wanted and apologized for nothing. But Preston Rourke had been different, and that difference scared her almost as much as it intrigued her. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable routine. Beatrice rose before dawn to help Mrs. Sullivan prepare breakfast for the boarders. She served the meal, cleaned the rooms, did laundry, and helped prepare dinner. The work was hard but honest, and Mrs. Sullivan was kind and patient as she taught Beatrice the way she liked things done. The boarders were generally respectful, and on the few occasions when someone got too forward or too friendly, Mrs. Sullivan had no hesitation in setting them straight. Beatrice began to relax in small increments, like a wild animal slowly learning that not every human meant harm. She started to sleep through the night without jerking awake at every sound. Her hands stopped shaking when she poured coffee. The tight knot of fear that had lived in her stomach for as long as she could remember began to slowly loosen. But she couldn't stop thinking about Preston Rourke. She found herself listening for news of him, perking up when the miners mentioned seeing his camp up in the hills, when the shopkeeper at the general store mentioned he'd been in for supplies. She told herself it was simple curiosity, nothing more, but she couldn't quite convince herself that was true. It was late July when she saw him again. She was in the general store, purchasing flour and sugar for Mrs. Sullivan, when the door opened and Preston walked in. He'd been in the sun, his skin bronze darker than before, and he looked even more like some wild mountain man than he had when she'd first met him. His hair was pulled back in a leather tie, and his arms were bare beneath his rolled-up sleeves, showing the play of muscle as he shifted the pack on his shoulder. Their eyes met across the store, and Beatrice felt her breath catch in her throat. A smile spread across Preston's face, lighting up his eyes. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, weaving through the displays to reach her. "It's good to see you. How have you been? Did things work out with Mrs. Sullivan?" "Yes, very well. Thank you again for the introduction. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't helped me that day." Preston waved off her thanks. "You would have figured something out. You strike me as a resourceful woman, but I'm glad it worked out. Mrs. Sullivan treating you well?" "She's been wonderful. The work is good, and I have my own room. It's more than I hoped for." They stood there for a moment, neither quite knowing what to say next. Beatrice found herself studying his face, the strong line of his jaw beneath the beard, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She realized she was staring and quickly looked down at her shopping list. "I should let you get back to your shopping," Preston said. "But I wanted to ask, would you like to have dinner with me sometime? There's a small restaurant down by the church, serves decent food. I'd enjoy the company, and I'd like to hear how you're settling in." Beatrice's immediate instinct was to refuse, to put distance between herself and this man who made her feel things she didn't understand. But something made her pause. She thought about his gentle voice, the way he'd stepped back when she flinched, the kindness in his eyes. She thought about how he'd asked, not demanded, and how he stood there patiently waiting for her answer without trying to pressure or persuade her. "I'd like that," she heard herself say. "I have Sunday evenings free." Preston's smile grew wider. "Sunday evening it is. I'll pick you up at the boarding house at 6 o'clock. Beatrice nodded, already wondering if she'd made a mistake. But when Preston tipped his hat to her and went to collect his supplies, she found herself smiling. Mrs. Sullivan noticed the change in Beatrice's demeanor immediately. "You're humming," she observed that evening as they prepared dinner. I don't think I've heard you hum before. Beatrice felt her cheeks flush. Was I? I didn't realize. Preston Rourke asked you to dinner, didn't he? Mrs. Sullivan's eyes twinkled. I saw him come into town this morning. How did you know? Because you have that look about you, and because Preston has been asking after you every time he comes to town for the past month. I figured it was only a matter of time before he worked up the courage to ask you properly. He's been asking about me? Beatrice set down the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables. Mrs. Sullivan nodded. Every visit. Always casual-like. Just checking to make sure you were settling in all right, that you were happy here. He's a good man, Beatrice. One of the best I've known. He'd never hurt you. Beatrice swallowed hard. How did you know that someone hurt you before? Mrs. Sullivan's voice gentled. Child, I'd have to be blind not to see it. The way you flinch at sudden movements, the way you keep your distance from the male boarders, the bruise you had when you first arrived. I've seen it before, more times than I care to count. But you're safe here, and Preston Rourke is not the man who hurt you. Give him a chance. You might be surprised. Sunday evening arrived faster than Beatrice expected. She spent an hour agonizing over what to wear, finally settling on her best dress, a simple green cotton that Mrs. Sullivan had helped her purchase from the dressmaker. She'd never had much occasion to care about her appearance before, but she found herself wanting to look nice for Preston. When she came down the stairs at 6 o'clock, Preston was waiting in the parlor, hat in hand. He'd cleaned up, his hair washed and shining, his beard neatly trimmed. He wore clean trousers and a pressed shirt, and Beatrice realized he'd made an effort for her just as she had for him. His eyes widened when he saw her. You look beautiful, he said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. Thank you. You look very nice as well. The restaurant was indeed small, just 6 tables in a cozy room attached to the church. The owner, a widow named Mrs. Chen, who'd come to California during the gold rush with her late husband, served them beef stew and fresh bread. The food was good, but Beatrice barely tasted it. She was too aware of Preston sitting across from her, of the way his long legs didn't quite fit under the small table, of how his hands dwarfed the coffee cup he held. Tell me about yourself, Preston said. Where did you grow up? Beatrice hesitated. She didn't want to talk about her past, didn't want to dredge up all those painful memories. But Preston waited patiently, not pushing, just giving her space to answer in her own time. Nevada? She finally said. On a cattle ranch about 50 miles from Carson City. My mother died when I was 8. After that, it was just me and my father. She took a sip of water, her throat tight. He wasn't a good man. He drank too much and had a terrible temper. When I turned 21, I decided it was time to leave. Preston's expression darkened, his jaw tightening, but his voice remained gentle when he spoke. That took a lot of courage. Leaving the only home you've ever known, striking out on your own with no plan and no safety net. You're stronger than you probably give yourself credit for. I don't feel strong. Most days I just feel scared. Being scared and being strong aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is keep moving forward even when you're terrified. Preston leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. After the war ended in '65, I came back to my family's farm in Missouri, but I couldn't settle. I'd seen too much, done too much. The person I'd been before the war was gone, and I didn't know who I was supposed to be anymore. So I packed a bag and started west. Ended up in these mountains and found I liked the solitude. Up there, I could be whoever I wanted to be, or no one at all. You were in the war? Beatrice asked. You must have been very young. I was 16 when I enlisted in '63. Lied about my age, thought it would be an adventure. His laugh was bitter. I learned real quick that war isn't an adventure. It's hell on earth. I'm 30 now, but sometimes I feel about 100 years old. Beatrice did the math in her head. If he was 30 and she was 21, that was 9 years between them. Not an insurmountable gap, but significant. Not that it mattered, she told herself. This was just dinner, just 2 people sharing a meal. What's it like, she asked, living up in the mountains by yourself? Preston's expression softened, a small smile playing at his lips. Peaceful, beautiful. Hard work, but honest. I run a trap line, hunt game, pan for gold in the streams when I need extra money. I built a cabin about 5 years ago, just one room with a loft, but it's solid and warm. In the winter, the snow comes up past the windows, and everything is quiet and white. In the summer, the wildflowers bloom so thick you can hardly walk without stepping on them. There are deer and elk, black bears, mountain lions. You learn to respect the land and the creatures on it, and they leave you alone in return. It sounds lonely, Beatrice said. It can be. But there are different kinds of loneliness. Being alone in the mountains is different from being lonely in a crowd. At least up there, the solitude is honest. He paused. But lately, I've been thinking it might be nice to have someone to share it with, someone who understands that kind of life, who wouldn't mind the isolation. The way he looked at her when he said it made Beatrice's heart skip a beat. She looked down at her plate, suddenly unable to meet his eyes. They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing easier than Beatrice had expected. Preston told her about his life in the mountains, about the challenges and rewards of living off the land. She told him about working at the boarding house, about Mrs. Sullivan's kindness, about the small pleasures she'd discovered in Jamestown. For the first time in her life, she felt like someone was truly listening to her, truly interested in what she had to say. When Preston walked her back to the boarding house, the sun had set, and the street was lit by oil lamps. They walked slowly, neither seeming eager for the evening to end. At the door to the boarding house, Preston stopped and turned to face her. "I had a really good time tonight, Beatrice. Would you like to do this again?" "Yes," she said, surprising herself with how quickly she answered. "I'd like that very much." Preston smiled, that warm, genuine smile that transformed his rugged features. "Good. I'll be back in town in 2 weeks. Maybe we could take a walk. Let me show you some of the trails around town." "That sounds nice." They stood there for a moment, and Beatrice wondered if he would try to kiss her. Part of her wanted him to, but a larger part was terrified of the prospect. She'd never been kissed, never wanted to be touched by any man. But Preston just tipped his hat to her, his movements slow and deliberate. "Good night, Beatrice. Sleep well." "Good night, Preston." She watched him walk away into the darkness, his tall form gradually swallowed by shadows. When she went inside, Mrs. Sullivan was sitting in the parlor with a knowing smile. "Don't say a word," Beatrice warned, but she was smiling too. "I wouldn't dream of it," Mrs. Sullivan replied, "but you might want to wipe that silly grin off your face before the boarders see you." Over the next few months, Preston's visits to Jamestown became more frequent. He always made time to see Beatrice, whether it was for dinner at Mrs. Chen's restaurant, walks along the trails that wound through the hills around town, or simply sitting on the porch of the boarding house in the evenings, talking until the stars came out. Beatrice found herself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. She'd never felt this way about anyone before. Preston was unfailingly patient with her, never pushing her beyond what she was comfortable with, always maintaining a respectful distance unless she indicated otherwise. His gentleness was a revelation. She'd spent her whole life believing that all men were like her father, rough and cruel and violent. Preston was teaching her that there was another way to be. It was late September when something shifted between them. They'd gone for a walk up into the foothills, following a trail that led to a small waterfall. The aspens were turning gold, and the air had that crisp quality that spoke of autumn approaching. They'd been walking for about an hour when Beatrice stumbled on a loose rock. Preston's hand shot out to steady her, his large palm wrapping around her upper arm. Beatrice's first instinct was to pull away, to flinch from the touch, but she forced herself to stay still. Preston's hand was warm through the fabric of her sleeve, his grip firm but careful, ready to release her the moment she showed any sign of discomfort. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern clear in his voice. "Yes, I just lost my footing." She looked up at him, at his face so close to hers, and something inside her shifted. "Preston, you can hold my hand if you want to. I think I'd like that." His eyes searched hers, making sure she meant it. Then, slowly, he released her arm and took her hand instead, his massive palm engulfing her smaller one. His skin was rough with calluses from his work, but his touch was gentle, so gentle it made tears spring to her eyes. "Is this all right?" he asked softly. Beatrice nodded, not trusting her voice. They stood there on the trail, hand in hand, and she marveled at how right it felt. This was nothing like her father's rough grabbing, nothing like the painful grip that left bruises. This was careful and respectful, a touch that asked permission rather than demanded compliance. They walked the rest of the way to the waterfall holding hands. When they reached the cascade of water tumbling down the rocky cliff face, Preston spread out a blanket he'd brought, and they sat together, watching the play of light on the water. "Beatrice," Preston said after a while, his voice serious, "I need to tell you something. These past few months, getting to know you, spending time with you, it's been the best thing that's happened to me in years. You're smart and strong and brave, and every time I have to leave town and go back to my cabin, I find myself counting the days until I can come back and see you again. I'm falling in love with you. I might have already fallen, and I need to know if there's any chance you might feel the same way." Beatrice's heart hammered in her chest. She'd suspected Preston cared for her, had seen it in the way he looked at her, the way he always made time for her, the gentleness of his touch. But hearing him say it aloud was different. It made it real. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I've never felt this way about anyone before. I don't know if I know how to love someone. My father, he destroyed something in me, made me afraid of men, afraid of being touched. But with you, it's different. When you hold my hand, I don't feel scared. I feel safe. I think I'm falling in love with you too, Preston. But I don't know if I can be what you need." Preston shifted on the blanket, turning to face her fully. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, and cupped her cheek in his palm. His touch was feather-light, as if she were made of something precious and fragile that might shatter at too firm a touch. "You don't have to be anything other than who you are," he said. "I'm not asking you to be perfect or to have everything figured out. I'm just asking if you'll let me love you, and if maybe someday you might love me back. We can take this as slow as you need. There's no rush. I'm not going anywhere." A tear slipped down Beatrice's cheek, and Preston's thumb gently wiped it away. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, letting herself feel the warmth of his palm against her skin. This was what tenderness felt like. This was what it meant to be treated with care and respect. She'd never known such a thing existed. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I want that. I want to try." Preston's smile was radiant. He leaned forward slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to, and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. His lips were warm and gentle, there and gone in a heartbeat, nothing threatening or demanding about it. "Thank you," he murmured against her skin. "Thank you for trusting me. I promise I will never, ever hurt you. I'll spend the rest of my life proving that you can trust me." They sat by the waterfall until the sun began to set, talking about the future in careful, hopeful terms. Preston told her about his cabin in the mountains, describing it in detail, painting a picture of what their life could be like if she decided she wanted that. Beatrice talked about her dreams, small and tentative as they were, of having a place that was truly home, of building a life free from fear. When they walked back to town, Beatrice kept her hand firmly in Preston's, marveling at how natural it felt, how right. Mrs. Sullivan took one look at them when they returned and smiled knowingly, but she kept her observations to herself. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Beatrice replayed every moment of the day in her mind. She touched her forehead where Preston had kissed her, still able to feel the ghost of his lips on her skin. She was falling in love, truly and deeply in love, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what that meant. The autumn passed in a golden haze of happiness. Preston came to town every week now, sometimes more often, always making Beatrice his first stop. They took long walks, shared meals, spent hours talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his childhood on the farm in Missouri, about his mother who'd died of fever when he was 12, about his father who'd never recovered from the loss and had passed away while Preston was off fighting in the war. She told him more about her own childhood, the painful memories coming easier now that she had someone who would listen without judgment. Preston was teaching her that touch didn't have to hurt. He would take her hand when they walked, brush a strand of hair from her face, rest his palm on her back when they stood close together. Every touch was careful, gentle, asking permission in its lightness. He handled her like she was made of precious gold, something to be treasured and protected, and slowly, so slowly, Beatrice began to believe that she was worthy of such care. It was early November when Preston asked her to come see his cabin. "I want you to see where I live," he said. "I want you to see if you could imagine making a life up there. It's isolated, and the winters are hard, but it's beautiful too. I think you'd love it." Beatrice was nervous about being alone with Preston so far from town, but she trusted him in a way she'd never trusted anyone. "I'd like that," she said. "When?" "This weekend. It's about a 4-hour ride from town. We'd leave Saturday morning, spend Saturday night at the cabin, and come back Sunday. I give you my word, Beatrice, I'll be a perfect gentleman. You'll have the bed, I'll sleep on the floor. Nothing will happen that you don't want to happen. I trust you, Preston." His eyes lit up at her words. "That means more to me than you know." Mrs. Sullivan was understanding when Beatrice asked for the weekend off. "That man is going to ask you to marry him soon," she predicted, "and when he does, you'd be a fool to say no. But you be careful up there in those mountains. Pack warm clothes, and make sure you're back by Sunday evening or I'll send a search party." Saturday morning dawned clear and cold. Preston arrived at the boarding house with 2 horses, a sturdy bay gelding for himself, and a gentler mare for Beatrice. He'd brought warm blankets and enough supplies for their journey. Mrs. Sullivan insisted on packing them extra food, pressing a basket into Beatrice's hands with stern instructions to make sure Preston fed her properly. The ride into the mountains was beautiful. They followed narrow trails that wound through pine forests and across mountain meadows. The air grew colder as they climbed, and Beatrice was grateful for the warm coat Mrs. Sullivan had helped her purchase. Preston pointed out landmarks along the way, showed her where he set his trap lines, where the best fishing spots were. He rode close enough that she could call out to him easily, but gave her space to manage her own horse. They stopped for lunch beside a clear stream, and Preston built a small fire to warm them. He heated coffee and shared the sandwiches Mrs. Sullivan had packed. Beatrice sat on a log watching him work, admiring the easy competence with which he moved. Everything he did was efficient and skilled, the result of years of living this kind of life. "You're staring," Preston said with a smile, not looking up from the fire. "I'm just thinking how different you are from anyone I've ever known. You make everything look so easy." "Years of practice. Besides, I like impressing you. Makes me feel useful." Beatrice laughed. "You are impressive. Sometimes I can hardly believe you're real." Preston did look up then, his storm cloud eyes serious. "I'm real, Beatrice, and everything I feel for you is real. Don't ever doubt that." They reached the cabin in the late afternoon. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, a solid structure built from logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. It was larger than Beatrice had expected, with a covered porch across the front and real glass windows. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Beatrice looked at Preston in surprise. "I came up yesterday to get everything ready," he explained. "Wanted to make sure the place was warm and welcoming for you." Inside, the cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft above. The furniture was simple but well made, clearly crafted by Preston's own hands. There was a large bed in one corner piled with thick quilts, a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove for cooking, and a stone fireplace that radiated warmth. Shelves lined one wall, holding books and supplies. Animal pelts hung from hooks, and dried herbs hung from the rafters. It was cozy and comfortable, a real home despite its simplicity. "Preston, it's wonderful," Beatrice said, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "You built all of this yourself?" "Every board and beam. Took me the better part of a year, but I wanted it done right. A man needs a solid roof over his head, especially up here where the winters get fierce." He set down their bags and moved to the stove. "Let me get some coffee going, and then I'll show you around the property." Over the next few hours, Preston gave Beatrice a tour of his mountain home. He showed her the small barn where he kept his horses and mules, the smokehouse where he cured meat, the root cellar stocked with supplies for winter. He showed her his trap lines, the places where he hunted, the stream where he fished. He explained how he survived up here, the rhythm of the seasons and the work each one required. Beatrice listened, fascinated. This was a completely different life from anything she'd known, challenging and isolated, but also free. Up here, there was no one to answer to, no one to fear. Just Preston and the mountains and the wild country that stretched in every direction. As the sun began to set, they returned to the cabin. Preston cooked dinner, venison steaks with potatoes and carrots, and Beatrice helped him, working side by side in the small space. They moved around each other easily, falling into a natural rhythm as if they'd been doing this for years. After dinner, they sat in front of the fireplace, mugs of coffee warming their hands. The fire crackled and popped, filling the cabin with flickering light and warmth. Outside, darkness had fallen complete and absolute, the kind of darkness that only existed far from civilization. "What do you think?" Preston asked quietly. "Could you see yourself living up here?" Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, considering. It was isolated, certainly, and the work would be hard, but she'd never been afraid of hard work. And the peace here, the utter absence of fear and violence, that was worth more than any comfort civilization could offer. "Yes," she said finally, "I think I could be happy here. With you." Preston set down his coffee mug and turned to face her fully. He took her hand in his touch as gentle as always. "Beatrice Zimmerman, I love you more than I thought I could ever love anyone. You're brave and beautiful and stronger than you know. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, building a home here in these mountains. Will you marry me?" Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. She'd known this was coming, had felt it building for weeks now, but hearing the words still made her heart race. She looked at Preston, at this man who'd shown her what gentleness looked like, who'd taught her that she was worth caring for, who'd never once raised his voice or his hand to her. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Preston, I'll marry you." Preston's face lit up with joy. He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully, as if she were made of spun glass. Beatrice wrapped her arms around him, feeling the solid strength of him, the warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. She felt safe in a way she'd never felt safe before, protected and cherished and loved. Preston pulled back just enough to look down at her face. "May I kiss you?" he asked softly. "I've been wanting to since the day I met you, but I wanted to wait until you were ready." "I'm ready," Beatrice whispered. He lowered his head slowly, giving her plenty of time to change her mind. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet, nothing forceful or demanding about it. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek with infinite tenderness. The kiss was brief, barely more than a soft press of lips, but it sent warmth flooding through Beatrice's entire body. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "I love you," Beatrice said, the first time she'd spoken the words aloud. "I love you so much, Preston. I love you too, more than words can say." They sat wrapped in each other's arms in front of the fire until the logs burned down to embers. True to his word, Preston insisted that Beatrice take the bed while he made himself comfortable on the floor near the fireplace with a bedroll and blankets. Beatrice lay in the big bed, warm under the quilts, listening to Preston's steady breathing and feeling more content than she ever had in her life. They returned to Jamestown the next day, both of them floating on happiness. Mrs. Sullivan took one look at Beatrice's face and pulled her into a tight hug. "He asked you, didn't he? And you said yes?" "I said yes," Beatrice confirmed, laughing. "We're getting married." "About time. That man has been mooning over you for months. When's the wedding?" "We haven't talked about that yet." "Well, don't take too long deciding. Winter's coming, and if you're going to be living up in those mountains, you'll want to be settled before the heavy snows start." Preston and Beatrice decided on a date in early December, giving them just enough time to make the necessary arrangements. It would be a small ceremony in the church, just a few friends and neighbors as witnesses. Preston would move Beatrice up to the cabin right after the wedding, and they'd spend the winter getting to know each other as husband and wife. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparations. Mrs. Sullivan helped Beatrice make a wedding dress, a simple but beautiful gown in cream-colored wool. The ladies of the town, many of whom Beatrice had met through her work at the boarding house, organized a small party and showered her with gifts, practical items they'd need for life in the mountains. Preston spent the time making improvements to the cabin, adding shelves and storage, making sure everything was ready for Beatrice's arrival. He built a proper bathing tub and installed it in a corner of the cabin, knowing she'd appreciate having that luxury. He stocked the root cellar with extra supplies and made sure they had enough firewood to last through even the harshest winter. The night before the wedding, Beatrice lay in her attic room at the boarding house, unable to sleep. She was nervous, not about marrying Preston, but about everything that would come after. She was about to commit her life to this man, to move to an isolated cabin in the mountains where she'd be completely dependent on him. If she'd misjudged his character, if the gentleness turned out to be a mask, she'd have nowhere to run. But even as the thoughts circled through her mind, she knew they weren't true. Preston had proven himself over and over again in the months they'd known each other. He'd been patient and kind and gentle, never pushing, always respecting her boundaries. He'd shown her what real love looked like, and she trusted him completely. The wedding day dawned cold and clear, the first snow of winter dusting the mountains with white. Beatrice dressed with Mrs. Sullivan's help, her hands shaking slightly as she buttoned the cream-colored dress. Mrs. Sullivan fussed over her hair, pinning it up and weaving a small wreath of evergreen branches through it. "You look beautiful, my dear," Mrs. Sullivan said, tears in her eyes. "Preston is a lucky man." "I'm the lucky one," Beatrice replied. "He saved me, Mrs. Sullivan. He gave me a reason to believe that life could be good." "You saved yourself, child. Preston just helped you see what you were capable of. Now come on, we don't want to keep that man waiting." The church was small but warm, the pews filled with friendly faces. Preston stood at the altar in a new suit, his hair neatly combed and his beard freshly trimmed. When Beatrice entered and began walking down the aisle, his face transformed with such pure joy that it took her breath away. The ceremony was simple and short. They exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Preston's kiss was gentle and sweet, mindful of their audience but full of promise for the future. After the ceremony, there was a small celebration at the boarding house. Mrs. Chen had prepared a feast, and there was music and dancing and laughter. Beatrice found herself swept up in the joy of it all, amazed at how many friends she'd made in the few months she'd been in Jamestown. These people cared about her, celebrated her happiness, and that was a gift beyond measure. As the afternoon wore on, Preston leaned down to whisper in her ear. "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Rourke?" Beatrice smiled at the sound of her new name. "Yes, let's go home." They said their goodbyes, accepting hugs and well wishes from everyone. Mrs. Sullivan cried openly as she embraced Beatrice. "You come visit me when you can," she insisted, "and if you ever need anything, you send Preston to town and I'll help however I can." "Thank you for everything," Beatrice said. "You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. I'll never forget that. You gave an old woman someone to fuss over. We're even." The ride up to the cabin took longer than usual thanks to the snow, but Beatrice didn't mind. She rode beside Preston, occasionally reaching out to take his hand, marveling at the fact that he was her husband now, that they belonged to each other. When they reached the cabin, Preston dismounted and came to help Beatrice down from her horse, but instead of simply offering his hand, he swept her up in his arms, making her gasp in surprise. "What are you doing?" "Carrying my bride over the threshold," he said with a grin. "It's tradition." He carried her into the cabin, which was warm and inviting, the fireplace already lit. He set her down gently, and for a moment they just stood there, looking at each other, both suddenly shy now that they were alone as husband and wife. "I'll go tend to the horses," Preston said finally. "You make yourself comfortable. I'll be back in just a few minutes." While he was outside, Beatrice looked around the cabin, seeing it with new eyes. This was her home now, their home. She moved to the shelves and saw that Preston had cleared space for her belongings. On the table was a vase filled with evergreen branches, a simple decoration, but one that showed he'd been thinking of her. Beside it was a wooden box she hadn't seen before. When Preston came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, Beatrice was holding the box. "What's this?" "A wedding present. Open it." Inside the box was a beautiful shawl, woven from soft wool in shades of blue and green. It was clearly expensive, far beyond what Preston could usually afford. "Preston, this is too much. You didn't need to." "I wanted to," he interrupted gently. "I saw it in the general store months ago and thought the colors would look beautiful on you. I've been saving up for it. Do you like it?" "I love it. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned." She draped it around her shoulders, and Preston was right. The colors suited her perfectly. "Good, I'm glad. I have something else for you too." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch. Inside were 2 gold rings, simple but well made. I had these made by the jeweler in town. I know we couldn't afford rings for the ceremony, but I wanted you to have one. It's not fancy, but it's solid gold, and it'll last." Beatrice felt tears spring to her eyes. "Preston, when did you have time to do all this?" "I've been planning for months, from the moment I knew I wanted to marry you. Here, let me." He took one of the rings and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Then he handed her the other ring. With shaking hands, Beatrice slipped the ring onto Preston's finger. It looked strange on his large, work-roughened hand, but right somehow. A symbol of the promise they'd made to each other. "Mrs. Rourke," Preston said softly, pulling her into his arms. "My wife." "My husband," Beatrice replied, and the word felt like magic on her tongue. That night, Preston was as gentle with Beatrice as he'd always been, patient and careful and tender. He never rushed, always checking to make sure she was comfortable, that she wasn't afraid. And Beatrice, who'd spent her whole life terrified of men and what they could do, found that with Preston there was nothing to fear. There was only love and gentleness, and a sense of rightness that settled deep in her bones. Afterward, lying in Preston's arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Beatrice felt truly at peace for the first time in her life. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For being gentle with me. For treating me like I'm precious. No one ever did that before you." Preston's arms tightened around her. "You are precious. You're the most important thing in my world, and I'll spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you know that." The winter passed in a blur of quiet happiness. Beatrice settled into life at the cabin, learning the rhythms of mountain living. Preston taught her how to maintain the trap lines, how to dress game, how to tell when a storm was coming by watching the sky and the behavior of the animals. She proved to be a quick learner, adapting to this new life with a determination that impressed Preston. In turn, Beatrice made the cabin into a real home. She organized the shelves, made curtains for the windows, started a herb garden in pots that she kept near the sunny window. She cooked meals that made Preston groan with pleasure, using the supplies they had to create dishes that were simple but delicious. She read to him in the evenings from the books on his shelves, her voice filling the cabin with warmth. The isolation that Beatrice had been worried about turned out not to be a problem at all. She loved the peace and quiet of the mountains, the way the snow muffled all sound and made the world feel soft and safe. She loved having Preston all to herself, with no interruptions or distractions. They spent long evenings talking, learning everything about each other, building a foundation of friendship and understanding beneath their love. Preston was an attentive husband, always mindful of Beatrice's comfort and happiness. He continued to touch her with that same careful gentleness, as if she were made of precious gold. Every morning, he'd kiss her forehead before getting out of bed. Every evening, he'd hold her close as they watched the fire. He never raised his voice, never made a sudden movement that might startle her. Slowly, over the course of that long winter, Beatrice's fears faded away completely. She no longer flinched at sudden movements or tensed when Preston reached for her. She'd learned that his hands would only ever hold her with care. It was late February when Beatrice realized she was pregnant. She'd been feeling tired and queasy for a few weeks, and when she missed her monthly courses for the second time, she knew. She was carrying Preston's child. She told him that evening as they sat by the fire. Preston had been carving a new handle for one of his knives, and Beatrice watched the play of firelight on his hands for a long moment before speaking. "Preston, I need to tell you something." He looked up immediately, setting aside his work. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. I'm going to have a baby. We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Preston just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face broke into the widest smile she'd ever seen. He set down the knife and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight but carefully, mindful now of the precious cargo she carried. "A baby," he breathed. "We're going to be parents. Beatrice, I'm so happy I could burst. Are you happy? Is this what you want?" "Yes," she said, surprised to find it was completely true. A year ago, the thought of having a child would have terrified her, but now with Preston, it felt right. "I'm a little scared, but mostly I'm excited. We're going to have a family, Preston. We are. And I promise, I'll be the best father I can be. Our child will never know fear or violence. They'll grow up surrounded by love and safety. I swear it." Beatrice believed him. She'd seen how gentle Preston was with everything, from the horses to the wild animals he trapped. He'd be a wonderful father. As spring arrived and the snow began to melt, Preston became even more protective of Beatrice. He insisted she rest more, wouldn't let her help with the heavier chores. He made the trip down to Jamestown to stock up on supplies and to speak with the doctor about what they'd need for the birth. He came back with armloads of cloth for diapers and baby clothes, with medical supplies and books about childbirth. Mrs. Sullivan sent word that she wanted to come up to the cabin to help with the birth when the time came, and Beatrice was grateful. Having another woman there, someone experienced and kind, would make the whole process less frightening. Summer arrived, and Beatrice's belly swelled with their growing child. Preston would rest his hand on her stomach in the evenings, marveling at the feel of the baby moving inside her. "Strong little thing," he'd say with pride, "takes after their mother." In late September, as the aspens turned gold again and the air took on that crisp quality of early autumn, Beatrice went into labor. Preston rode down to Jamestown at breakneck speed to fetch Mrs. Sullivan and the doctor, then paced nervously outside the cabin while the women worked. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Beatrice cried out in pain, and each cry was like a knife to Preston's heart. He wanted to be in there with her, wanted to hold her hand and help somehow, but Mrs. Sullivan had firmly told him to stay outside and let the women handle it. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, Preston heard a new sound, the thin wail of a newborn baby. He bolted for the door, but Mrs. Sullivan met him there with a wide smile. "You have a son," she announced, "a big, healthy boy. And Beatrice is tired but doing well. Give us just a few more minutes to get everything cleaned up, and then you can come in." A son. Preston felt tears prick at his eyes. He had a son. When Mrs. Sullivan finally let him enter, Preston found Beatrice propped up in bed, looking exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a bundle wrapped in soft cloth, and when Preston approached, she pulled back the fabric to reveal a tiny red face. "Meet your son," Beatrice said softly. "I thought we could name him Peter, after your father." Preston's throat closed up with emotion. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at his son, at the tiny perfect features, the small hands curled into fists. "He's beautiful. You're amazing. I can't believe you did this." "We did this," Beatrice corrected. "He's ours, Preston. Our son." Preston reached out and carefully took the baby, holding him with the same gentle care he always showed. Peter opened his eyes, dark blue like all newborns, and seemed to look right at his father. In that moment, Preston felt his heart expand in ways he hadn't known were possible. "Hello, Peter," he whispered. "I'm your father, and I promise you, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you're safe and loved. You'll never know the kind of pain your mother and I knew growing up. You'll only know love." Mrs. Sullivan stayed for 2 weeks, helping Beatrice recover and teaching her how to care for the baby. She showed her how to nurse, how to change diapers, how to soothe Peter when he cried. Preston was an eager student as well, learning everything he could about caring for his son. When Mrs. Sullivan finally returned to Jamestown, she left behind a family, happy and healthy and deeply in love. Preston took to fatherhood like he took to everything else, with patience and gentleness and a deep commitment to doing it right. He would spend hours with Peter, holding him, talking to him, showing him the mountains that would be his home. Beatrice watched her husband with their son and felt her love for him deepen even further. He was everything she'd never dared to hope for, a man who was strong without being violent, protective without being controlling, gentle in all the ways that mattered. The years that followed were filled with joy and hard work. Peter grew into a sturdy, happy child, fearless and curious about the world around him. Preston taught him to ride, to track animals, to respect the land. Beatrice taught him letters and numbers, read to him from books, made sure he understood kindness and compassion. When Peter was 3, Beatrice gave birth to a daughter they named Penelope. 2 years after that came another son, Patrick. The cabin that had once seemed spacious now felt cozy and full, but Preston solved that by building an addition, adding 2 small bedrooms so the children would have their own space as they grew. Life in the mountains was never easy, but it was good. They faced hard winters and lean times, dealt with injuries and illnesses, worked from dawn to dusk to keep food on the table and the cabin maintained. But they faced everything together, Preston and Beatrice, their partnership growing stronger with each passing year. Beatrice never forgot what her life had been like before Preston. Sometimes, late at night, she'd wake from a nightmare about her father, about the ranch, about the bruises and the fear. But Preston would be there beside her, gathering her into his arms, whispering words of comfort and love until the fear faded away. He was her anchor, her safe harbor, the proof that goodness existed in the world. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston gave Beatrice a necklace he'd made himself, a delicate chain with a small gold locket. Inside the locket were tiny portraits of their 3 children, painted by an artist in Jamestown. "I want you to always remember," Preston said as he fastened it around her neck, "that you're not just my wife. You're the mother of my children, my best friend, my partner in everything. You're the reason I wake up happy every morning. You took a broken man who was hiding in the mountains and showed him what it meant to really live." "You weren't broken," Beatrice protested. "You were healing, just like I was." "Then we healed each other," Preston said, "and built something beautiful in the process." Beatrice touched the locket, feeling the weight of it against her chest. "I love you, Preston Rourke. Thank you for being gentle with me, for showing me what love really means. You saved my life in more ways than one." "You saved mine too. We saved each other." They stood on the porch of their cabin, looking out at the mountains that had become their home, watching their children play in the clearing. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the air was filled with the sound of their children's laughter. This was what happiness looked like, Beatrice thought. This was what it meant to be loved and to love in return. She'd been so broken when she'd first arrived in Jamestown, so convinced that she'd never escape the cycle of fear and violence that had defined her childhood. But Preston had shown her another way. He'd touched her like she was made of precious gold, treated her with a gentleness she'd never known, and in doing so, he'd taught her that she was worthy of love and care. As the years continued to pass, Preston and Beatrice watched their children grow into fine young adults. Peter inherited his father's size and strength, his gentle nature and work ethic. He became a skilled tracker and hunter, but he also had his mother's compassion, always the first to help a neighbor in need. Penelope was smart and curious, constantly reading and asking questions, determined to know everything about the world beyond the mountains. Patrick was the wild one, always climbing trees and exploring, but with a sweet disposition that made it impossible to stay angry with him for long. The cabin in the mountains became known throughout the region as a place of warmth and welcome. Travelers passing through would stop for a meal and a warm bed, and they always left commenting on the obvious love that filled the Rourke household. People would see the way Preston looked at Beatrice, the way he still held her hand after all these years, the way he still touched her with that same careful gentleness, and they'd know they were witnessing something special. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the cabin. Peter had married a sweet girl from Jamestown and had given them 2 grandchildren. Penelope had gone east for school but had come home for the celebration. Patrick, now 18, was apprenticing with a surveyor, learning to map the wilderness he loved so much. That evening, after the feast and the celebration, Preston and Beatrice walked together to the spot where he'd first proposed, the small waterfall where their life together had truly begun. They stood hand in hand, listening to the cascade of water, watching the stars come out one by one. "Do you ever regret it?" Preston asked. "Choosing this life? It's been hard, I know. We've struggled and sacrificed. You could have had an easier life in town." Beatrice turned to face him, reaching up to cup his bearded cheek with her palm. His hair was streaked with gray now, and lines creased the corners of his eyes, but he was still the same man who'd helped her that day in Jamestown, still strong and gentle and kind. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me everything I never knew I needed. You taught me what it meant to be loved, to be treated with care and respect. You gave me a family and a home and a life worth living. How could I ever regret that?" Preston pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "I'm the lucky one. I was living half a life up here before you came along. You brought light and love and purpose. You made me want to be better, to be worthy of you. You always were worthy. You just needed to see it." They stood together as the stars wheeled overhead, two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built a life of love and gentleness in a harsh and unforgiving world. They'd had their struggles and their sorrows, their hard times and their losses, but through it all, they'd had each other, and that had made all the difference. As they walked back to the cabin, where their children and grandchildren waited, Beatrice thought about the girl she'd been when she'd first stepped off that stagecoach in Jamestown. That girl had been so scared, so broken, so convinced that she'd never be anything more than a victim. But Preston had seen something in her that she hadn't seen in herself. He'd seen strength and courage and the capacity to love, and in seeing it, he'd helped her become it. She'd never known a gentle touch from a man before Preston, but he'd touched her like she was made of precious gold, and in doing so, he'd transformed her from a frightened girl running from her past into a woman who could face the future with confidence and joy. That was the greatest gift anyone had ever given her, and she'd spent every day of their marriage trying to give him the same gift in return. Inside the cabin, surrounded by family and love, Preston wrapped his arm around Beatrice's shoulders and pulled her close. She leaned into him, this man who'd been her salvation and her partner, her best friend and her great love. Around them, their children laughed and talked, their grandchildren played at their feet, and the fire crackled warmly in the hearth. This was home. This was love. This was the life they'd built together, one gentle touch at a time, one day of kindness and care, building upon the last until they'd created something beautiful and lasting. Beatrice closed her eyes and sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the day she'd stumbled into Preston Rourke in the dusty street of Jamestown, for the gentleness he'd shown her, for the love that had bloomed between them and grown into this rich, full life. "I love you," she whispered to Preston. "I love you too," he replied, "always and forever." And that was how their story ended, not with drama or tragedy, but with quiet contentment and enduring love. They lived out their days in the mountains they loved, surrounded by family, secure in the knowledge that they'd found in each other everything they'd ever needed. Preston continued to touch Beatrice with that same careful gentleness until his very last day, and she continued to marvel at the gift of a man who could be so strong, yet so tender. Their love story became legend in those mountains, a tale told around campfires and dinner tables about the mountain man and the broken girl who'd healed each other and built a life of such profound beauty that it inspired everyone who witnessed it. They grew old together, watched their grandchildren have children of their own, and when they finally passed, within days of each other, as if neither could bear to be without the other, they left behind a legacy of love that would echo through generations. The cabin stood for many years after, a monument to what they'd built, and those who visited it would always comment on the sense of peace and love that seemed to linger in its walls, as if the gentleness Preston had shown Beatrice had soaked into the very wood and stone of their home, making it a place of sanctuary for all time.